بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to another in our series on Al-Qawa'id Al-Fiqhiyya, Islamic legal maxims. In the last episode we were discussing a maxim that is not frequently mentioned in the books of Qawa'id Fiqhiyya, but it is a maxim in the sense that phrasing is a concise distillation of a principle that is found scattered through the books of fiqh of the different madhabs. And so it qualifies as being a qa'ida fiqhiyya. And this particular qa'ida is pretty much the cornerstone on which Islamic finance is based, in the sense that it allows for a markup on a delayed payment sale, and that is not classified as riba. So we began discussing evidence for this principle in the previous episode, and we talked at some length about the verse وَأَحَلَّ اللَّهُ الْبَيْعَ وَحَرَّمَ الرِّبَا, and the argument which Allah rejected by making that statement of the pagan Arabs who said trade is exactly like riba. إِنَّمَا الْبَيْعُ مِثْلُ الرِّبَا. There's no difference between them. And we mentioned that Ibn Abbas, in explaining the attitude of these pagan Arabs, in the tafsir of At-Tabari, Ibn Abbas is quoted as saying that these pagan Arabs said, we don't see any difference between charging more at the beginning of the contract and charging more at the end. So charging more at the beginning of the contract is a built-in markup. At the beginning of the sale, it's contractually stipulated that this item is going to cost you $1,200. And the reason that it's not $1,000, I mean, obviously that wouldn't be stated in the contract, but it's the reasoning behind that stated price. If the price is normally $1,000, the reason that the seller is charging $1,200 in this particular deal is because he's not getting his money immediately. The buyer is getting immediate benefit from the good. The seller is not getting immediate benefit from that transaction. So if the person is selling a good that normally costs $1,000 and he's not getting payment immediately, the buyer is walking away from that deal with immediate benefit, and the seller is not getting his full benefit. His benefit is delayed. So it's valid for him to ask for more because he is not getting the same benefit from the deal that he would be getting if it was a cash sale. There's an argument, it's an interesting argument against riba. It's made by a German anarchist economist named Silvio Gesell, who was active in the first half of the 20th century. He made a parable about Robinson Crusoe, and he's washed up on this desert island, and he begins to take care of himself, and after a while he's made himself a couple of suits of clothes, and he's grown some crops, he's harvested grain, and he's decided that he needs to build an irrigation project in order to increase his livelihood, bring in more water so they can grow more grain. And in order to work on this project, he can't work on his farm. So now he's saved up grain, he's saved up various capital in the form of goods. And he's about to start on his project when this other person washes up on the shore, and he doesn't have clothes, he's buck naked, he doesn't have food, he doesn't have anything. So he comes walking up to Robinson Crusoe, and he wants to buy some grain and a pair of clothes from Robinson Crusoe. And Robinson Crusoe says, okay, but I'll give you 10 kilos of grain, and when you're ready to pay me back, I want 15 kilos. And the man says, well, my religion prohibits me from dealing in interest, whether taking it or giving it. So Robinson Crusoe says, well, that's all fine and well, but, my religion doesn't prohibit me. So the other guy says, well, I'll show you why it's in your interest to give me this grain, 10 kilos now, and I'll give you 10 kilos later. So they're looking down at this heap of grain that Robinson Crusoe has stockpiled, and they notice some insects starting to crawl into the grain. So the shipwrecked sailor says, you seem to have a bug problem with your grain here. And he said, yeah, it is a problem. And the man said, and if you leave it there like that, it's also, not only will the insects attack it, but it'll also be attacked by fungus. And so Robinson Crusoe says, yeah, you got a point there. And he said, well, it would take you labor in order to try to deal with this problem. And even then you might not be able to solve it. But if you give me 10 kilos now, I'll give you in the future 10 perfectly fresh, good kilos of grain, which will have saved you the expense of storing and protecting that grain. And so when you look at what is a real economy composed of, it's an exchange of goods and services. Money is only an intermediary, a medium of exchange that facilitates the real economy, which is exchange of goods and services. And real goods are always subject to entropy. Things like decay, attack by insects and fungus, and issues like that, metal rusts. So any real good, if you hold on to it, it's going to cost money to store it. And it will deteriorate over time the longer you hold it. So if somebody takes it off your hands now and starts using it and pays you for it later, they've actually, even if they're paying you the spot price, they're actually doing you a favor by precluding your need to expend energy and money to protect that good while it's being stored. So from a certain angle, that sounds plausible, but Silvio Gesell's parable is based on a situation where there's only one buyer and one seller. So what happens if you have 10 buyers? I mean, a real economy will have many buyers and many sellers. So two buyers, prospective buyers, walk into a showroom of a car dealer, and one of them is willing to put down $12,000 right now and walk out with a car, and the other one only has $1,000. Now, if somebody is willing to put up $12,000, then the seller will for sure prefer to get the cash money all in full right now. And in order for it to make sense for the seller to sell on delayed payment, I mean, he would like to see some added increase. Otherwise, why bother to sell? Another argument against Silvio Gesell in this regard is that those manufacturers, they need to pay their workers. They need to pay those who supply them with the raw materials that they use to manufacture finished goods. So if they're required to wait for 2-3 years to get the full amount of the price that they expended in producing the good, they won't be able to keep producing the goods. So this idea of Sylvia Gessel's, the parable that he gave, is flawed. If we look at some of the examples that we mentioned earlier of like the Prophet ﷺ, when he mortgaged his armor for barley, the narrations that talk about that situation don't mention whether the Prophet ﷺ paid more for that barley because he paid for it over time. They're silent about that. But one of the arguments that there was a markup in that is that the person who sold to him was a Jew. And there are two angles of reasoning with regard to why he would have asked more. One is the Quranic evidence, وَلَتَجِدَنَّهُمْ أَحْرَصَ النَّاسِ عَلَى حَيَاةٍ, that the Quran says about this particular group of people that they are the most avid with regard to the life of this world. I mean, they want their benefit. Another is based on Jewish law, which states that if you're a Jew, you can't charge interest to a fellow Jew, but it is perfectly lawful to charge interest to a Gentile, to a non-Jew. So with regard to the statements of scholars on this point, we go back to another Hanafi scholar, Al-Kasani, author of Badai' al-Sanaya, which is one of the foremost books of Hanafi fiqh. He's talking about a sale being an exchange contract. It's an exchange contract, therefore a basic requirement is some kind of parity between what is being exchanged on both sides. And then he says there's a difference in value between spot and delayed delivery of the same amount. He says, وَلَا مُسَاوَاةَ بَيْنَ النَّقْدِ وَالنَّسِيئَةِ لِأَنَّ الْعَيْنَ خَيْرٌ مِنَ الدَّيْنِ وَالْمُعَجَّلْ أَكْثَرُ قِيمَةً مِنَ الْمُؤَجَّلِ. There's no equality between spot and deferred payment because cash is better than debt, and the immediate has a higher value than the deferred. Now, if you look at various writings of Muslim scholars, you'll find actually that it sounds like they're making contradictory statements. On the one hand, you come across these statements scattered throughout the books of fiqh. What is the title of this maxim? Al-ajalu lahu hissatun min al-thaman. Deferment constitutes a part of the price. And then in other places, they'll say, Al-ajalu la yuqabiluhu shay'un min al-thaman. Deferment does not correspond to any part of the price. So how can these two statements, which are on the surface directly contradictory, how can they be reconciled? So they go on to say that this later statement, that deferment does not correspond to any part of the price, that it is a negation in literal terms. Well, let's take a break and we'll come back.
Dialogue, discussion, debate, rebuttal, conclusion.
Eliminate misconceptions about religion. Get enlightened.
Witness Dr. Zakir Naik in a battle of words in Crossfire tonight at 8:30 p.m. and repeat telecast at 10 a.m. India on Peace TV.
Say indeed, my prayers, my sacrifice, my life and my death are all for Allah, sustainer of the world.
A dynamic.
I challenge any human being to point out a single fundamental of Islam
In youthful quest.
which is against humanity as a whole.
Iconic, inspiring, encouraging.
Don't judge Islam based on the following.
Farik Naik.
Judge Islam based on the authentic sources, that's the glorious Quran and the authentic Hadith.
Son of the world-famous orator on Islam and comparative religion, Dr. Zakir Naik.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us an opportunity to do a profit job and to earn a profit reward.
A star above par in Teens Star. Next on Peace TV.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome back. We're discussing the seeming contradiction between statements of scholars where they say that deferment constitutes a part of the price and deferment does not correspond to any part of the price. So if we look at some of the other statements of scholars with regard to this issue, we said that the majority of jurists, including the 4 imams and the scholars of their schools, have overwhelmingly agreed that it is permissible to charge a markup on a delayed payment sale. And one example of a statement in this regard, the Shafi scholar Al-Mawardi, he says that if a trustee, a guardian of an orphan, he's ministering, he's managing the estate that this orphan has inherited, he said that he must look out for the orphan's interest if he sells any of the orphan's property. And one corollary of that principle is that payment must be spot because it better protects the orphan's wealth. Then he went on to say that there's an exception that can be made for a delayed payment if the deferred price is higher than the spot payment and the buyer can be reasonably expected to pay. And the Hanafi scholar Al-Marghinani, he says, فَإِنَّهُ يُزَادُ فِي الثَّمَنِ لِأَجْلِ الْأَجَلِ, because the price increases due to the deferment. Ibn Taymiyyah, he said, وَإِذَا بَاعَهُ إِيَّاهُ بِالْقِيمَةِ إِلَى ذَلِكَ الْأَجَلِ فَإِنَّ الْأَجَلَ يَأْخُذُ قِسْطًا مِنَ الثَّمَنِ. If he sells it to him for a price for that deferred period, then the deferred period takes a portion of the sale price. Now, Imam Shawkani, who wrote Nail al-Awtar, he mentions that there was a minority view. There were a few scholars, Zayn al-Abidin, Ali ibn Hussein. He was a reputable scholar, and we respect him. And there's a branch of Shiism called the Zaydi madhab that take a lot of their fiqh rulings from his opinion. And so he was of the opinion that a markup on a deferred payment sale is unlawful, and there were some scholars from the Zaydi madhab who also followed him in that opinion. Another person who's mentioned as having an opinion in this regard is Simak ibn Harb, who is not very, he doesn't have a great deal of status as a jurist. He's more known as a narrator of hadith. And, he's not, even in that realm, he's not a top-flight narrator. So the argument that, or the evidence that is presented by these dissenting scholars for their view, hadith related by Abu Hurairah that the Prophet ﷺ prohibited 2 sales in 1 sale. One of the hadith scholars who collected this hadith was Imam at-Tirmidhi. So the way that Imam at-Tirmidhi organizes his book is that after mentioning the hadith, he'll briefly discuss some of the opinions of some scholars regarding the meaning of the hadith and its implications. And so one of the explanations of what does that mean, 2 sales in 1 sale? There's a considerable amount of scholarly opinion. Various scholars offered various opinions about what that means. So one of the opinions that at-Tirmidhi mentions is that the seller offers an item to the buyer at one price for spot payment and at a higher price by a delayed payment. But he goes on to show or to state that actually the objection to this framing of a sale in this way is not because one price is higher than the other. It's because they didn't decide which price they're going to seal the deal on. It can be this or it can be that, and then one of them walks away with the good and it's left hanging. From the get-go, that whole explanation is a bit strained to me. The more plausible explanation of what does it mean, 2 sales in 1 sale, is the explanation of Ibn al-Qayyim. He said 2 sales in 1 sale is an ina sale. The seller sells in deferred payment for a higher price, and then the buyer turns around and sells it back to him in cash for a lower price. So that's 2 sales in 1 sale. And in some wordings of the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, when that goes on, then the sale should be at the lower price, otherwise it'll be riba. So both prices would be the same in that situation, the spot price and the deferred price. Now, if we look at some of the manifestations of this principle in fiqh, from classical fiqh, as I've mentioned repeatedly, the 4 schools of thought allow a markup on a deferred payment sale. Now, the opposite of a deferred payment sale is what's called a forward sale, or in Arabic, salam. And we've mentioned salam sales a number of times, that what that is that the buyer pays today and the seller promises to provide him the good of specified amounts and meeting certain specifications on a specified delivery date. Now, because the buyer, if you look at Ibn Humam, he's talking about how this is an anomalous contract, and he says, well, the reason that the Sharia allows it is due to need. For the seller, it gives him working capital, especially this is useful to farmers, that they have working capital to buy the seed and to plant their crop, and it facilitates production. From the point of view of the buyer, what Ibn Humam says is that because he's paying now and he's delaying his benefit, he has a right to expect a lower price.